Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. Year after year, we hear that America's infrastructure is deteriorating, that we are not doing nearly enough to repair, maintain, and improve our roads, bridges, water systems, schools, ports, and so forth. How bad is it? The U.S. economy is 6 times larger now than it was in 1955, but we're not investing any more in our critical infrastructure today than we did then. How does this make sense? I'll ask my guest, a man who knows as much about infrastructure and construction issues as anyone in the country. He's Barry LePatner, founder of LePatner Associates, a construction law firm based in Manhattan, and author of Too Big to Fall, America's Failing Infrastructure and the Way Forward. Barry, welcome.
Bob, good to be here with you.
Thank you so much for coming in. You know, let's start with an overview of America's infrastructure. It's a word that tends to put people to sleep, although you and I both think it's incredibly important. But what kind of shape is our infrastructure in?
For most of the history of the United States, we were #1 in the world on the subject of infrastructure. We were the envy of other countries. We committed a real robust percentage of our GDP to building new and maintaining our roads, our ports, our bridges, our water supplies, our electric grid. It enabled and made our country great through things like the Erie Canal, the TVA dams, our interstate highway system, and the like. But for decades now, we've forgotten that mission, and we've forgotten what is important to our national security, our economic security, our position globally, because we ship from interior of our nation all around the world to ports, and we've lost track of what role government must need to play if we are to be a stronger nation in the world economy.
Right. And explain why we need government to do this, because there are so many people who suggest, well, you know, free enterprise and you want private business to do this, that as much as possible. Why does government have to play such a large role?
I was reminded about that a year ago when I read a book called American Amnesia. And what this book identified was that from the very beginning of our nation, the business world always needed government involvement in order to move forward with new innovation, new research, new projects, new investment. And since the 1980s, if you look at how that interaction between government and business took place, you don't see as much investment by our government in encouraging business to do the things that they did when John Kennedy says, we're going to be on the moon in 10 years.
Right.
And the investment by NASA and other space agencies in research has benefited every American wildly over the last 50 years.
So there's this synergy that works out there. The government does those things that businesses actually can't do. Businesses are there to make a profit, you know. So you have to take care of the roads and the bridges and the airports and the schools and so much, you know. Business cannot and actually can't afford to take care of all that. It's the reason we pay taxes. On the other hand, though, this paves the way for business, and then some of the great innovations, and then all the other benefits you get from business, not to mention employment that goes along with it, works as well for the American people. So it does seem that we've forgotten a lot of that. But now today when we look around at the infrastructure, it's not just that we have enormous traffic jams, that a lot of our roads and bridges are not in great shape. There are all kinds of other problems with infrastructure. Do you consider it a crisis?
Well, if you look at what we would define as critical infrastructure, the critical systems and facilities that make up our water pipes that deliver clean water,
Right.
our rivers that are supposed to be clean but are now toxic dumps for manufacturing along the way that we've tried to clean up. If you look at the electric grid, if you look at our roads and bridges which are becoming imperiled, you realize that if you do not put a substantial investment into maintaining these systems, they fall apart and they require you to build anew. Take an example. In the 2 years before the I-35W bridge in Minneapolis collapsed on August 1, 2007,
Right.
the Minnesota legislature was asked to invest $17 to $18 million in the critical support system that would have added integrity to a bridge that was identified as about to fail.
The bridge would not have collapsed.
Would not have collapsed had they invested that $17 to $18 million. The legislator said, we're not going to make that commitment. It's a budget buster. The bridge went down, killed 13 people, and injured another 145 people, including school children on a bus who dropped 100 feet.
I went out there and covered that catastrophe. It was all awful.
It was awful. The federal government then sent out $135 million to rebuild that bridge as if that's an imperative. That's what we do. But no one understood that risk.
Beyond this horrific loss of life and the folks who were injured and the property that was lost, just give us the numbers again, compare what would have been spent if the legislature had paid attention and appropriated the money in the beginning versus how much it cost to replace the bridge.
Well, it was $17 to $18 million that would have added the structural integrity underneath the bridge, something legislators would not have had a photo opportunity for.
Right.
But that ignorance of the realities that reports from engineers had told them was a significant risk, was thrown out the door. In turn, the federal government did a bailout and now stepped in and put in, over $130, $150 million to put a new state-of-the-art bridge in that really we have not learned a lesson from because other bridges are in similar situations around the nation.
You mentioned that we seem to have forgotten the lessons of the past when we used to build infrastructure and maintain it, and seem to have understood the importance of it. Why did we lose sight of that importance?
I think we have had a major quantitative shift in the political recognition about the things that have made our country strong. If you are not investing in maintenance, you are building a system that is doomed to failure. We all know that. The engineering analysis have shown that.
We know that in our own homes. We know that with our automobiles, the things that we own. We understand what will happen if you don't take care of them, if you don't maintain them, if you don't do maintenance. But we don't understand it on a national level.
We don't do risk analysis that factor in the depreciation of our built facilities. If we look at our house and we have a leaky roof, we spend the $500 to get that leak done, because if we don't, very soon it's going to be $15,000.
Right. We understand that.
We do not apply a similar analysis to our bridges, our roads, our electric grid, our ports. And more than that, there has been a conscious decision by Congress after Congress over 40 years. This is not a Republican and a Democratic issue. It's a decided agreement that we are not going to raise taxes to put money into these systems which benefit every citizen in this country. There is no citizen who can make the argument, I'm not benefiting from good infrastructure.
But ultimately, it's Pennywise and Poundfoolish, isn't it?
Well,
just like the bridge in Minnesota.
5 years ago, the American Society of Civil Engineers said the problems of the money needed to bring our standards up to current day value on our infrastructure was $3.3 trillion. 5 years later, they're putting a number of over $4 trillion. If we continue to ignore it, we're going to have an astronomical, further astronomical addition onto that bill to come.
But it seems that we're doomed to pay a terrible price in any event, and by that I don't just mean a monetary price. So if we need to spend more than $4 trillion, and we're not going to spend anything like that kind of money, we know that we're not. But not only that, the Trump administration and its allies in Congress are guaranteed, or I'll put it a different way. They desperately want tax cuts. They want to pass a huge tax cut plan. So in order to pay for the plan, they'll be looking for parts of government to cut to help offset the costs of these tax cuts. So where does that leave infrastructure? You're going to cut taxes. You're going to be cutting other programs to try and pay for these tax cuts. And yet we're told that we need over $4 trillion to rebuild our infrastructure. How does any of this equate?
It equates perfectly well if you're not in the real world. The Trump plan to invest $1 trillion is wonderfully received by everybody.
This was a plan that was proposed some months ago, yeah.
Yeah, and during his campaign.
Yeah.
And it came out in April, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But it said, we'll invest $200 billion of government funding, and the other $800 billion will come from the private sector.
Oh, there you go.
So when you talk about that, you now have to go to the infrastructure funding sources, and there are hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of money waiting to invest in U.S. infrastructure. But what's the deal? And now we get to it. What's the deal? For me to invest billions of dollars in a new roadway or rebuilding a bridge or a facility like a port or an airport, I got to have a return on investment to my shareholders for 75 or 99 years.
You're not doing it out of the goodness of your heart.
No. There is no central agreement throughout the states or with the federal government that has identified a clear path to those public-private partnerships that could release this $800 million. And that's the problems that we're going to have. Because if we're not going to raise the gas tax, which has been 18.4 cents a gallon since the era of Bill Clinton, and we haven't raised it at all, then we have a shortfall in the monies allocated for our maintenance. On new stuff, we're going to have to find new sources, or the federal government's going to have to understand that every dollar that they invest is going to have a ripple effect, a salutary ripple effect on spurring acknowledged money from the private sector.
How should we be paying for infrastructure improvements in the broad sense, not just roads and bridges? Where should that money come from?
Because we've allowed this situation to get, to use a simple phrase, out of hand, we're going to need private sector money. Not as a giveaway to say to them, we'll give you 15% interest a year if you put your money in. That's not going to sell to the public or to private interests. But we have to also recognize that the federal government has always invested substantial monies in our combination with business. We invested federal monies in the Erie Canal by giving away rights of way along that path so that they could use it to build along the way. We gave grants to our Intercontinental Railroad that made the states from the Mississippi all the way to California become enriched by people wanting to move there, getting land grants and the like. We invested money in the TVA, and that spurred huge development in the Appalachian areas of Tennessee, Kentucky, etc. We need to come back to that mindset where leadership says we are taking hold of this subject. We're not going to let go until we find the combination of solutions which are going to require raising some taxes along the way, because states, about 30 states, have raised state gasoline taxes to pay for the infrastructure where the federal government has not stepped in recent years.
The Barack Obama and the Congress at the time of the Great Recession, in an effort to fight off the effects of the recession, actually passed and implemented a significant infrastructure program. I thought at the time it should have been larger, and I thought that they could have done a program that would have employed more people. But they had a program. How do you think it worked out? Assess the effort that they made.
Of the $787 billion in the ARA legislation, only $27 billion went to put people back to work.
Right.
We had huge unemployment at the time. What we failed to recognize then, and we still fail to recognize today, is that when you commit billions of dollars throughout the states for rebuilding our ailing infrastructure, you can put 2 million unemployed construction workers at work at high-paying jobs. And here's what happens. Of that 2 billion, 30% of it immediately comes back in the form of federal and state taxes. So now you're down significantly to that government investment.
Yeah.
But what happens to that money? Every time I work as a worker and I get paid, I reinvest it in my community.
It's going right into the economy.
And it churns and it churns and it pays itself. It's a deficit reduction plan, or it's deficit neutral at the very least when we do that. No one wants to take ownership of that concept.
And with interest rates extremely low, and they've been low, but they've been even lower, but it's been low for such a long time. It's a no-brainer. This enormous investment. You borrow the money at ridiculously low interest rates. We put all these folks that you're talking about to work. But you're establishing a new platform and an improved platform for businesses going forward. I mean, it seems like a no-lose situation, and yet we don't do it.
When World War II came, the debt of the United States right after World War II was 25% of our GDP. It was a huge proportion. We didn't pay that debt back until 1980s. It did not burden our economy because we had one of the greatest spurts in economic growths that raised our current middle class to its present status.
Exactly.
We have lost the understanding and the underpinnings of how our economy generates the financial support to make our people great when we've forgotten these basic rules.
Talk about climate change a little bit. To what extent has climate change emerged as an infrastructure issue? It would seem to me that there are a lot of steps on a broad front that we need to be taking, we're not taking them, in the effort to cope with climate change, which is upon us now, global warming.
Climate change is a big new factor in moving forward on resurrecting our ailing infrastructure. I was just down in New Orleans, and of course they've had billions of dollars of improvements to their levee system since Katrina in 2005. But everybody knows today, and NASA photographs have confirmed, that New Orleans is still sinking at 1.6 inches a year. The metrics that they built a levee system are not dealing with that reality. Houston had unfettered growth, no zoning controls.
Right.
Everybody failed to recognize that when you have a clay structure and you start building on it, you reduce drainage possibilities. They are going to continue to have problems in Houston, Miami, New York City. As smart as New York City thinks it is, if we don't put in a lock system the same way London has put in along the Thames and Amsterdam has done to save that country from flooding, we are doomed to see at least 25% of Manhattan underwater in the years ahead. And I'm not saying the far years, I'm saying in the next few years that is likely to happen by all demographers, by all scientists, by all weather specialists.
We've already seen disasters downtown with flooding. It's upon us now.
It's a reality.
So, but this is also an opportunity. I mean, it seems to me that you mentioned Kennedy and the space program, and we learned so much by sending the men to the moon in 1969. So the effort to do that, we learned a tremendous amount. This seems similar We would learn so much if we fully engaged the climate change issue. It would advance our society much further into the 21st century, but it would also be an amazing source of employment, wouldn't it?
I think about recent books I've read that said that handheld smartphone, the concept of the internet, the idea of Wi-Fi, everything we hold near and dear to these things we walk around relying on how do we get information, really would be never have happened had NASA not needed to develop computer programming to talk to the astronauts when they got to the moon.
Isn't that something?
None of this would have happened. And the outgrowths of that from Bell Laboratories, from Xerox, from all the companies that put that knowledge of what government had financed into long-term research continues to benefit each one of us today.
Have there been any surveys or other indications about how the public feels when individual men and women begin to talk about infrastructure? Are they willing to make the investments which would require increased taxes to improve infrastructure? Do you have a sense of that?
When you hear about the subject of raising taxes for infrastructure, I think back on the studies that they've done in the last few years where there were bond issues strictly to raise money to improve roads and bridges. I believe more than 90% of those state bond issues have passed.
They passed.
When there was an articulate discussion about why we need to raise this money and the long-term implications. But if you talk about infrastructure in general, and you ask the kinds of questions leading up to, would you want to have your gas taxes raised, people step back a minute and think differently. Because we used to identify problems as here's the problem, here's a solution, and as David Brooks once wrote in a wonderful column, he said, and we used to think what's in our best interests about the alternative solutions, and then we'd act. As a nation, we've stopped doing that. And when we have done it, it's always been overlaid by the filter of, I don't want my taxes raised.
Isn't that something? We have less than a minute left, but if you could wave a magic wand and money was no object, what are the first couple of steps you take in dealing with America's infrastructure?
First of all, we need to understand that infrastructure is no longer a local issue. It's no longer a state issue. It's a regional, if not a national issue. Every one of these issues, water runs through rivers. If you put one upstream part of the river is polluted, it affects others. Our national grid is fractured, our electrical grid. So I believe, and I've been a strong advocate for years across the country, we need to appoint an infrastructure czar who gathers up all of the necessary information, including environmental, including meteorological, including regional transportation issues, and makes regional decisions to allocate needed funds, and then can work out the right deals with the equity money that wants to come in and improve infrastructure. Combine that with government and watch what happens.
Let's hope we can take some steps in that direction. We've run out of time. Thank you so much, Barry LePatner.
Always a pleasure, Bob.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. We know that chronic traumatic encephalopathy, known as CTE, is a big problem in professional football. This degenerative brain disease, which can only be diagnosed post-mortem, is being found in an extraordinary percentage of professional football players whose brains have been donated for study by their grieving families. Frank Gifford was found to have had the disease, and Bubba Smith, and Junior Seau, and Kenny Stabler, and those are just a few of the very famous players who were afflicted. Most of the players who contracted CTE were never household names, including one of my favorite players, Jim Hudson, a safety on the 1969 Super Bowl winning Jets. Now we're learning that CTE afflicts not just professional football players, but college and high school players as well. This awful disease is casting a very dark cloud over America's most popular spectator sport. But it's not just CTE that's a problem. Football is so violent that many of its players, a tremendous number and a tragically high percentage of the players, are left virtually crippled after their playing days are over. And those playing days don't last that long because the relentless physical pounding and the terrible injuries that result force the players out of the game when they should be in their physical prime. Just this year, more than 200 players have been lost for the season due to terrible injuries, including Aaron Rodgers of the Green Bay Packers, the Giants' Odell Beckham Jr. and Brandon Marshall, and J.J. Watt of the Houston Texans, perhaps the best defensive player in the sport. The average length of an NFL career in 2008 was a shade under 5 years. It has since dropped incredibly to just over 2.5 years. That's how long the average NFL career lasts. I'm a rabid football fan. I have loved the sport for decades, but the mental and physical toll has reached a point where it is difficult, on moral and ethical grounds, to justify its continued existence in its present form. That's all for now. See you next time.